Erev Shabbat Shalom Rabotai. We are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Shabbat. We are up to Perek Vav Mishnah Dalet. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilun Nishmat Neria ben Tzvetlana Aranbayev Neriyahu ben Burcha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden. Amen. In yesterday's Mishnayot we enumerated the Lamitet Melachot, the 39 Melachot, forbidden works on Shabbat. And then we discussed the last Melacha on that list, transferring the Melachav, transferring from public domain to private domain, vice versa, and carrying 4 amot in a public domain. And we said, as a rule, a person is not liable for transferring unless the item that he carried has significance. So today's Mishnah is going to list common substances and the minimum amount that is considered significant for each one. Hamotzi teven kimlo fi para, one who takes out grain straw, which is used to feed cows, is liable only if he carries enough to fill a cow's mouth. Now, the Mefarshim explained that we're referring to stalks of grain that are left after the edible kernels have been removed. The stalks are shredded and fed to animals. Now, like the Mishnah says, you're only liable if you carry enough to fill a cow's mouth, because since it's used to feed cows, a cow's mouthful is the smallest amount that people would bother keeping. Etza kimlo pi gamal, one who transfers bean straw, which is used to feed camels, which the Mefarshim explain, straw from certain types of bean plants, kimlo pi gamal, is liable only if he carries enough to fill a camel's mouth, because bean straw is not fed to cows, but it is fed to camels. Therefore, it's a camel's mouthful, which is larger than a cow's mouthful, that is the smallest significant amount in the case of a bean straw. We're going to go by the camel's mouth. Amil kimlo pi taleh. Amil, which is used to feed sheep, which the Mefarshim explain, like the tevin, the grain straw mentioned above, amir is also from the stalks of grain plants. However, tevin consists of the lower part of the stalk, while amir is the upper part of the stalk, which is the section that is cut off with the ear when the grain is harvested. It's softer than the lower section. So we're talking about the upper part of the stalk, which is cut off, which is the section that's cut off with the ear when the grain is harvested. Now this is used to feed sheep. Kimlo pi taleh has to be enough to fill a sheep's mouth, which the Mefarshim explain. Amir is soft enough to feed to a sheep. Therefore, a sheep's mouthful, which is smaller than a cow's, is a significant measure. Asavim kimlo pi gedi, grasses which are used to feed young goats, enough to fill a young goat's mouth, because the Rav explains grasses are fed to both sheep and goats. However, since a young goat's mouthful is smaller than a sheep's, a goat's mouthful is the smallest significant measure. Ale shum vale bitzalim, in the case of garlic leaves and onion leaves, which the Mefarshim explain, the leaves of these plants that sprout above the ground, the law depends on the state that they are in. Lachim ki grogeret, if they are fresh and fit for people to eat, the minimum is the measure of a dried fig, which the Mefarshim explain, an amount equal to the volume of an average size dried fig. This is the minimum for all types of food that are eaten by people, like we're going to see in the Mishnah below. Yivishim kimlo pigedi, if they are dry and fit only to feed goats, the minimum is the amount needed to fill a young goat's mouth. Now the Mishnah states the rule where a person transfers 2 of these substances together, for example, half a measure of grain straw along with half a measure of bean straw, ve'en mitztarfin zeim ze mipnei shelo shavu b'shiurehen, and they do not combine with each other to make up a required minimum, because their minimum amounts are not the same. Since each substance has a different minimum, each is viewed separately and does not combine with another to form an amount for which one would be liable. And the Mefarshim explain that the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, page 76a, limits the Mishnah's rule as follows. We view a substance that has a relatively small minimum measure as strong, since less of it's required to be considered significant, whereas a substance that has a larger minimum measure is weak. A weak substance cannot help to complete the required minimum for a strong substance, but a strong substance can help complete the minimum for a weak one. So to give an illustration, grain straw, which the minimum is a cow's mouthful, is, so to speak, stronger than bean straw, which is the minimum, for which the minimum is the larger measurement of a camel's mouthful. Therefore, if a person carries an amount of grain straw and an amount of bean straw that together equal a cow's mouthful, he's not liable, because a cow's mouthful is the minimum required for the stronger material, the grain straw, and a weaker material, the bean straw, cannot complete the minimum measurement of a strong one. However, if a person carries an amount of grain straw and an amount of bean straw that together equal a camel's mouthful, he is liable, provided the combination can be fed to a camel, because in this case it is the stronger material that is completing the minimum of the weaker one, as Rashi explains on page 76 in Masechet Shabbat. The Mishnah now discusses edible food. Hamotzi ochalim ki grogeret hayav. One who transfers edible food, meaning anything fit for human consumption, that is at least the size of a dried fig, is liable. Now the Mefarshim quote the Gemara Masechet Eruvin on page 4b, Halacha Moshe Misinai states that all edible food has the same minimum measure, the volume of a dried fig. Umitztarfin ze im ze mipnei sheshavu b'shiurehen. And if one transfers different kinds of food, they combine with each other to add up to the size of a dried fig, because their measures are equal. Since all foods require the same minimum measure, the size of a dried fig, they combine to form this measure. Chutz miklipehen v'gar'inehen v'uktzehen v'suban umursanan. However, excluded from the measure are their shells, pits, stems, coarse bran, and fine bran. Now, bran is the shell or husk of the wheat kernel. Some of the bran falls off when the wheat is pounded. That's the coarse bran. The rest remains until the kernels are ground and the flour is sifted. The sifting separates the fine flour, which falls through the holes in the sieve, and the thicker pieces of bran which are left on top. That which is left in the sieve is called the fine bran. So these will all be excluded from the measure. The Mefarshim explain these do not combine with the actual food to make up the minimum for edible food, because they are not usually eaten by people. However, Rabbi Yehuda partially disagrees with regard to shells. Chutz miklipe adashim shemitbashlot imahen. Chutz miklipe adashim shemitbashlot imahen. This is true of all shells except for the soft inner shells of lentils that are cooked together with the lentils. Since they are commonly cooked and eaten together, the shells combine with the lentils to complete the minimum measure. The Rav does bring down Ven Alachak Rabbi Yehuda. The Alachak does not follow Rabbi Yehuda. That is in Rabotai of chapter 7, Mishnah 4. We begin now with chapter 8, Mishnah 1. Continuing from the last chapter, this chapter also lists minimum quantities that are considered significant in regard to the melacha of transferring. The first Mishnah discusses liquids. We will be doing Mishnah number 1 today. Hamotzi yain kedem mizigat kos. One who takes undiluted wine outside is liable if it is enough that when mixed with 3 parts water will produce a cupful, a revi'it. Now the Mefarshim explain, in those times wine was too strong to drink on its own and was mixed with 3 parts water. Therefore, 1/4 of a cupful of raw wine produced 1 complete cupful of drinkable wine. So you had 1/4 was wine, raw wine, so to speak. The other 3/4 were water. That was a full drinkable cup of wine. By cupful, the Mishnah means a cup of wine on which blessings such as Birkat Hamazon and Kiddush are recited. So for this purpose, the cup must measure at least a revi'it, which based on different opinions is between 2.9 and 5.1 fluid ounces, which 86.4 to 150 cc, depending again on the opinions. Therefore, a person is liable if he carries 1/4 of the revi'it of undiluted wine, since upon being mixed with 3 parts water, that quantity makes the revi'it of drinkable wine. Halav kedigmi'ah. One who takes milk outside is liable if it is enough for a person to swallow in 1 gulp. Dvash kedeliten ala katit. Honey enough to apply to a sore. Now honey, the Rav explains, was used as an ointment on the backs of horses and donkeys for sores that they had sustained by carrying heavy loads. Now although honey is usually eaten, it was also used as an ointment. The rule for a substance that has 2 frequent uses is that even if one carries the smaller minimum which suffices for only one of the uses, he is liable. So in the case of honey, the minimum considered significant for eating is the size of a dried fig, like we saw in the previous Mishnah, chapter 7, Mishnah 4, which is larger than the measurement useful for ointment. However, one who carries enough honey for use as an ointment is liable, even though it's not enough to be significant as a food. Shemen kedei lasuch evel katan, oil enough to rub on a small limb, which the Rav explains the smallest limb for which it would be used, so the little toe of a day-old child. Mayim kedei lashuf baim et a kilo, water enough to rub into kilo, which was an eye ointment. The Mefarshim bring down, the Meiri explains, water was mixed with crushed herbs to create a type of eye ointment, collyrium, a healing ointment that was applied to the eye. So to be liable for transferring water, one must carry enough to produce this eye ointment for a single application to one eye. Vishal kol hamashkin bervi'it, for all other liquids, meaning liquids fit for drinking and not used for medical purposes, medicinal purposes, right? All the liquids, the minimum is a revi'it. V'chol hashofchin bervi'it, and for all wastewater, the minimum is a revi'it. Now, wastewater is fit only for making clay. For that use, too, a revi'it of water is the minimum that's considered significant. Rabbi Shimon Omer, but Rabbi Shimon disagrees, and he says, Kulan berevi'it, the minimum for all of them, wine, milk, etc., is a revi'it. Velo amru kol hashirin alalu ela lematzni'ehen. The measures listed above, the enough to apply in a sore, enough to swallow in one gulp, enough to rub on a limb, the Rabbi Shimon says it was only stated in regards to those who store such small amounts. If a person actually stored one of these liquids in the amount listed, he would be liable for carrying that amount because he has shown that he considers it significant. But for all other people, the minimum is a revit. Now, Rabbi Shimon is making 2 points in the Mefarshim say. Number one, most people are not liable for carrying a liquid unless it measures at least a revit. And number two, a person who stores any of the previously listed liquids in the amount defined above, each of which is less than a revit, is liable even for carrying that small amount since it's significant to him. Now, with the second point, Rabbi Shimon argues with the Tana of the Mishnah, chapter 7, Mishnah 3, who said, any substance that is not fit for people to store, or is not in an amount that people would store, one would not be liable for transferring it unless he is a person who stores it. Now, these words imply that for a person who stores less than the usual amount, there's no minimum measurement. Rather, he is liable for carrying even the slightest quantity. Rabbi Shimon, however, rules even such a person is exempt unless he carries a certain minimum. However, the Rav does say, Ven halacha ki Rabbi Shimon, the halacha does not follow Rabbi Shimon. That is in Rabotai, today's Mishna Yomi. Everybody should have a Erev Shabbat Shalom. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.